It started with a whisper. I was passing by my daughter's room when I overheard my wife's voice, low and serious. "He'll live in the attic. But don't tell Daddy. He'll get upset and won't buy you any toys." My heart froze. At first I thought I misheard her. Maybe it was about a pet, or maybe a weird joke. But the way she said it, her tone, it didn't feel right. My stomach churned as a million scenarios raced through my mind. Who was she talking about? And why was she keeping it from me? I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the slightly cracked door. My daughter's soft giggle followed, but my wife's voice remained hushed, sharp. It wasn't playful, it was deliberate. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, debating whether to push the door open and confront her right there. But something stopped me. A part of me was scared of the answer, scared of whatever explanation might follow. Instead, I backed away slowly, my socks muffling my footsteps against the wooden floor. I turned toward the attic hatch at the end of the hallway, that small square in the ceiling with a dangling string. The attic. How long had it been since I'd gone up there? Months? Years? It was a place I rarely thought about, a space for forgotten boxes, old decorations, and discarded memories. But now it felt like a black hole in the middle of my home, pulling at me with a force I couldn't ignore. I forced myself to take a deep breath, but it barely made a difference. My chest felt tight, like a steel band was wrapped around my ribs. A strange mix of dread and curiosity pulled me forward. I needed answers, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered that I wouldn't like what I found. My hand hovered over the attic pull string as my heart pounded in my ears. I could still hear faint noises coming from my daughter's room, but they felt distant now, like echoes from another world. The string felt cold and rough against my fingertips as I pulled it down. The attic ladder unfolded with a creak, the sound slicing through the quiet house like a knife. I winced, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting my wife to come storming out of the room, demanding to know what I was doing. But nothing happened. The hallway remained empty, the door to my daughter's room still ajar. I hesitated at the foot of the ladder. Every instinct told me to stop, to turn around, to confront my wife and demand answers directly. But I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, one step, then another, until I was climbing into the attic, my head rising above the entrance. The air up there was stale and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Something faintly musky, almost like cologne. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling barely illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows over the scattered boxes and old furniture. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to adjust as I scanned the room. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Just the usual forgotten junk holiday decorations, some old photo albums, mismatched chairs. But then I noticed a neatly folded blanket draped over a small cot pushed against the far wall. It wasn't dusty like everything else. It was clean. Fresh. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, my feet careful on the creaky wooden floorboards. Beside the cot was a small wooden crate acting as a makeshift table. On it sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey, a glass still streaked with amber residue, and God, my stomach turned a toothbrush. Someone had been living up here. Someone had been sleeping, drinking, and existing right above me. My knees felt weak as I crouched down beside the crate, my trembling hands hovering over the items. The toothbrush, the bottle, the crumpled candy wrappers stuffed into the corner of the crate, it all painted a picture. And I hated what I was seeing. This wasn't just someone sneaking up here occasionally, this was someone who had made themselves comfortable. Someone who felt safe. I spotted a duffel bag tucked just behind the cot, partially unzipped. Inside were men's clothes. A few wrinkled shirts, a pair of jeans, socks. None of them were mine. I reached for one of the shirts and froze when I caught a faint scent clinging to the fabric. It was familiar. A fragrance I had smelled before, but I couldn't immediately place it. My mind raced as I tried to connect the dots, my wife, the attic, the whispers, and now. This, my pulse pounded in my temples as cold realization crept over me, spreading like ice water in my veins. Whoever was staying up here wasn't just some stranger. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. I pushed myself back onto my feet, my legs trembling under my weight. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to get out, to run downstairs and demand an explanation. but at the same time I felt paralyzed. My brain refused to fully process what I was seeing, what it all meant. The faint sound of my daughter's laughter echoed up through the attic hatch, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. My daughter. How much did she know? What had she been told? My wife's words came back to me in sharp clarity. He'll live in the attic, but don't tell Daddy. The attic felt smaller now, suffocating. The low ceiling seemed to press down on me, the stale air clogging my lungs. I couldn't stay up here any longer. I turned and stumbled back toward the hatch, nearly missing a step as I climbed down the ladder. My knees buckled slightly as my feet hit the hallway floor, my breath ragged and uneven. I stood there for a moment, staring at the open attic entrance above me. My vision blurred as I tried to process what I'd just seen, but my mind refused to settle on any one thought. Instead, it felt like white noise, a chaotic mess of fear, anger, and confusion swirling inside my head. The hallway felt impossibly quiet now, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My wife's voice was no longer audible from my daughter's room, and the door was now closed. I didn't know whether to confront her immediately or wait. Every second felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the walls felt like it was watching me. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The attic, the whispers, the suitcase, it was all unraveling into something far worse than I could have imagined. And whatever came next, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The attic smelled like dust and something else, something faintly musky, like cologne. As I flicked on the light, my eyes adjusted to the cluttered space. And then I saw it. Clothes. A suitcase. A pair of men's shoes neatly tucked under an old chair. There was even a half-empty bottle of whiskey on a crate. None of it was mine. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. My eyes darted from one object to the next, taking in every detail, every piece of evidence that felt so wildly out of place in this forgotten corner of my home. The suitcase was black, scratched at the edges, but not dusty like everything else around it. The shoes, polished and lined up carefully, looked like they had been placed there just recently. The whiskey bottle glistened faintly under the single, dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. I stepped closer, each footfall creaking against the wooden floorboards, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the heavy silence. My hand hovered over the whiskey bottle, hesitating before I picked it up. The glass was still slightly sticky around the neck, as though someone had taken a drink not too long ago. The scent of the liquor mixed with the faint smell of cologne hanging in the air, creating a nauseating cocktail that turned my stomach. My gaze fell on the suitcase again, my fingers trembling as I reached for the zipper. It wasn't locked. The teeth of the zipper hissed softly as I pulled it open, and inside I found clothes, men's clothes. Wrinkled button-up shirts, a couple of pairs of slacks, a belt coiled neatly at the side, and underwear folded with deliberate care. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone staying, someone living up here, hidden right above me. I rifled through the clothes with shaking hands, my fingers brushing against something hard at the bottom of the suitcase. I pulled it out, a wallet, brown leather scuffed at the edges but familiar. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I turned it over and opened it. There, in the transparent sleeve, was an ID. The face staring back at me was someone I knew, someone I had trusted, someone I never, in a million years, would have expected to see connected to this nightmare. The world tilted slightly as I tried to steady my breath, the edges of my vision going blurry. I closed the wallet and dropped it back into the suitcase, my hands now visibly shaking. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into something dark and endless. Every logical explanation my brain tried to come up with was immediately crushed by the evidence in front of me. I turned away from the suitcase and scanned the rest of the attic. A crumpled blanket lay on the small cot in the corner, with an indentation still visible on the thin pillow. Someone had been sleeping here recently. A half-empty pack of mints sat next to the whiskey bottle on the crate, along with an old paperback book, its spine cracked and its pages dog-eared. Whoever was up here wasn't just passing time, they were comfortable. They were settled. The worst part wasn't the objects themselves, it was the way everything had been arranged. Neat, careful. Almost like someone had taken great care to remain hidden, but still maintain some sense of normalcy. It wasn't chaotic or rushed, it was deliberate. I backed away slightly, my head pounding as if my skull were being squeezed in a vice. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how this had happened, how long it had been going on, and most importantly, how I had missed it. I thought back to the whispers I'd overheard. "He'll live in the attic, but don't tell Daddy." The words felt like poison now, seeping into every corner of my mind. How long had my wife been keeping this secret? How many nights had I slept just feet below another man hiding above me? Did she sneak up here when I was at work? Did she bring him food, talk to him, laugh with him? Did my daughter know him? Did she talk to him? The questions kept piling up until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The attic, once just a dusty storage space, now felt claustrophobic, as though the low ceiling was pressing down on me, trapping me in this nightmare. I staggered back toward the attic hatch, my eyes darting one last time over the makeshift living space. A duffel bag rested near the cot, zipped up but bulging slightly from whatever was inside. A pair of socks lay crumpled nearby, carelessly tossed aside. A small lantern, the battery-operated kind, sat next to the cot, its faint glow suggesting it had been used recently. Every little detail painted a bigger picture, one I wasn't ready to look at fully. I gripped the ladder tightly as I began my descent, my feet trembling with every step. The light bulb above cast long shadows on the attic walls as I pulled the hatch shut behind me, the ladder folding up with a hollow metallic clank. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the closed attic hatch above me. The hallway was silent again, the faint whispers and laughter from earlier now replaced by a suffocating stillness. The house felt different, cold, unfamiliar. The realization hit me like a freight train: this wasn't my home anymore. At least it didn't feel like it. Somewhere along the way, it had become something else, a stage for a secret life playing out just above my head. A secret life my wife had carefully crafted, hidden away behind closed doors and hushed whispers. My hands shook as I wiped the sweat from my brow, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to confront her, to burst into our bedroom and demand answers. But I couldn't, not yet. I needed a moment to process this, to understand what came next. I turned my head slightly toward the closed door of my daughter's room, my wife's soft voice faintly audible behind it once again. The words were muffled, but the tone calm, almost sweet, felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. I didn't know what was worse, the betrayal itself, or the fact that it had been happening so close, so carefully hidden in plain sight. But one thing was certain: I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was going on, whatever truth was still waiting to be uncovered, I was standing at the edge of it now, and there was no turning back. I sat in my car for hours, parked a few blocks away from the house. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but it felt like the only thing anchoring me to reality. The discovery in the attic played over and over in my mind like a broken record. The cot, the whiskey bottle, the suitcase, and most disturbingly, the wallet. The face on that ID was burned into my vision, and no matter how much I tried to shake it, it wouldn't fade. It felt impossible to accept, and yet the evidence was undeniable. The man living in my attic wasn't just anyone, it was someone I knew. Someone who had been in my home before, laughing at my jokes, shaking my hand, making casual conversation while sitting at my dinner table. The betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the familiarity. It was in the sheer audacity of how close this had been to me the entire time. I kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with him. Had there been signs? Subtle glances? Inside jokes I hadn't caught? I felt like an idiot, like I had been sleepwalking through my own life while someone else moved in the shadows above me. The humiliation was suffocating. My wife, my partner, the woman I had trusted with my life, had not only crossed a line but had done so in the most calculated and cruel way possible. I leaned back in the driver's seat, staring up at the faint glow of my house in the distance. From this angle, it looked perfectly normal, a warm family home, lights glowing softly through the curtains. Anyone passing by would think everything was fine, that inside those walls lived a happy family with a loving mother and father. But I knew better now. That house wasn't a home anymore. It was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion held together by lies and secrecy. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, pulling me out of my spiral. It was a message from my wife. "Where are you? Dinner's ready. Are you okay?" My stomach turned at the sight of her name on my screen. The nerve she had to act so casual, so concerned. How many times had she lied to me like this? How many times had she looked me in the eye and told me she loved me while he was just a few feet above us, hidden behind wooden beams and dusty insulation? I turned off my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I couldn't face her, not yet. I couldn't go back into that house, sit across from her at the dinner table, and pretend that everything was fine. But I also couldn't stay here forever. Eventually I would have to walk back through that door and face whatever twisted reality awaited me. Time passed in strange, uneven chunks. At some point I noticed my reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, a man I barely recognized staring back at me. I had to pull myself together. I couldn't let her see me like this, couldn't let her know how deeply the discovery had shaken me. When I finally started the engine and drove back to the house, every moment felt surreal. The familiar creak of the front door, the soft glow of the hallway light, the distant sound of my daughter's laughter, all of it felt wrong. Like a movie set designed to mimic my life. My wife appeared in the hallway, smiling softly. "Hey, there you are." I was starting to get worried. Her face was so calm, so practiced. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed her concern was genuine. But now, every smile, every glance, every gentle touch felt tainted. I mumbled something about needing fresh air and brushed past her into the living room. Dinner was set on the table, warm food carefully plated, candles flickering softly. It was perfect, too perfect. Like she was trying to distract me, trying to make everything feel normal. My daughter sat happily munching on her food, oblivious to the storm brewing just under the surface of our lives. I sat down at the table, but every bite of food felt like ash in my mouth. My wife chatted casually about her day, asked me how mine had been, and laughed softly at something our daughter said. But her voice sounded distant, muffled, like I was hearing it through a layer of glass. My eyes kept drifting upward toward the ceiling, toward the attic. Was he up there now, listening? Waiting for me to leave the house again? Did he hear us talking, hear our daughter's laughter? The thought made my stomach twist until I thought I might be sick. At one point, my wife reached across the table to touch my hand, her fingers warm against my skin. "Are you okay? You seem a little distracted tonight." I stared at her hand on mine, at the wedding ring glinting faintly under the light. How many lies had been told with that same hand? How many times had those fingers touched someone else while I was at work, while I was sleeping, while I was right here under this roof? I pulled my hand away and forced a tight smile. Just tired. Long day. She nodded, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to our daughter. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I barely tasted the food, barely registered the words being spoken around me. All I could think about was the attic, the smell of cologne, the wallet, the faint indentation on the pillow. After dinner, my wife took our daughter upstairs to get ready for bed. I stayed downstairs, staring into the flickering candle flames until they burned out entirely. When the house was finally quiet, when the lights upstairs had been turned off and the soft murmur of the television filled the background, I made my move. I went to the garage and grabbed a red plastic fuel canister. It was still half full from when I'd last mowed the lawn. The smell of gasoline hit me immediately as I twisted off the cap, the sharp fumes clawing at the back of my throat. I walked through the house in silence, the canister heavy in my hand, my feet steady despite the chaos in my mind. I paused at the bottom of the attic ladder, staring up at the hatch. I could still feel him up there, his presence like a weight pressing down on me. I imagined the look on his face if he knew what was about to happen. But I didn't care. I doused the attic entrance first, then moved room by room, splashing gasoline across the floors, the walls, the furniture. The house reeked of it now, a sharp, chemical scent overpowering everything else. When I was done, I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The night air felt cool against my face, sharp and cleansing. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't hesitate. I lit a single match, let it flicker between my fingers for a brief moment, and then dropped it. The flames erupted almost instantly, consuming everything they touched. As I walked away, the heat at my back and the glow of the fire reflecting in the dark sky, I felt something break inside me, something final and irreparable. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, away from the ashes of the life I thought I knew. I drove without a destination, the night swallowing me whole as the glow of the fire faded in the rearview mirror. The faint smell of gasoline still clung to my clothes, a reminder of what I'd done, of the finality of it all. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, knuckles pale from the force of my grip. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past few hours was fading now, leaving a hollow ache in my chest and a weight in my stomach that felt like lead. I could still see the flames dancing in my peripheral vision every time I closed my eyes, consuming everything I'd once called home. I thought about my daughter, about her small, innocent face as she ate dinner earlier that evening, completely unaware of the dark undercurrents swirling around her. She didn't deserve this. None of this was her fault. But what kind of life could I have given her in a house so thoroughly poisoned by betrayal? Could I have stayed and pretended that everything was fine? Could I have shared a bed with the woman who had so carelessly torn our family apart? The answers were clear, even if they were painful. The face from the ID flashed in my mind again, and a sick feeling clawed its way up my throat. Of all the people in the world, why him? Someone I'd trusted, someone who had been close enough to have access to my home, my family. How long had this been going on? How many times had he been in my space, eating my food, drinking my whiskey, sleeping with my wife? Every detail felt like a new wound, raw and bleeding, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop the torrent of questions from flooding my mind. The highway stretched out endlessly in front of me, empty and dark except for the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. I had no plan, no end goal, just distance. Distance from the house, from the attic, from the lies. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the crushing weight of what I'd left behind. At some point, I pulled into an empty parking lot behind an all-night diner. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale blue glow across my windshield. I turned off the engine and sat in silence, my head resting against the steering wheel. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the faint sound of distant traffic were the only noises breaking the stillness. I felt hollow. Not angry, not sad, not relieved, just empty. Like something essential had been scooped out of me and replaced with silence. The realization of everything I'd lost hit me like a freight train. My home, my marriage, my family, all of it was gone, reduced to ash and smoke. Eventually, I stumbled out of the car and into the diner. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, the smell of burnt coffee and greasy food hitting me immediately. A tired-looking waitress glanced up from behind the counter, gave me a once-over, and gestured to an empty booth in the corner. I sat down heavily, my body feeling like it was made of stone. A cup of coffee appeared in front of me moments later, steam curling up from the surface. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. The waitress lingered for a second, like she wanted to say something, but then she turned and walked away without a word. I was grateful for her silence. Staring into the murky depths of the coffee, my mind wandered again. I thought about the attic, the makeshift cot, the whiskey bottle, the wallet. I wondered if my wife had ever considered the consequences of what she was doing. Did she ever stop to think about what would happen if I found out? Or did she believe she could keep the secret buried forever? Did she even feel guilty, or had the lies become second nature to her? I remembered the sound of her voice as she spoke to our daughter earlier that night. "Don't tell Daddy, he'll get upset." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just lying to me, she was using our daughter as a shield, pulling her into a web of deceit she should have never been a part of. That hurt more than anything else. Somewhere deep inside me, a flicker of anger started to burn. Not the wild, uncontrollable rage I'd felt earlier, but something colder, sharper. How could she have done this to me, to us, to our family? I had given her everything, my time, my love, my loyalty, and she had thrown it away without a second thought. I thought back to the early days of our relationship when everything felt simple and easy. The way she used to smile at me, the way her laugh would fill a room. Had any of it been real? Or had she always been capable of this level of betrayal? I wanted to hate her. I should hate her, but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of loss. The coffee had gone cold in front of me, but I didn't care. I sat there for hours, staring at the empty booth across from me, replaying every moment of the night in my head. I thought about what came next. Where would I go? What would I do? Could I start over, build a new life from scratch? Or would I always carry this weight with me, this scar that no amount of time or distance could ever erase? Eventually, the sky outside began to lighten, streaks of pale orange and soft pink cutting through the darkness. The waitress came by again, her voice soft as she asked if I wanted anything else. I shook my head, left a crumpled bill on the table, and walked out into the cold morning air. I climbed back into my car, the seat still faintly warm from the night before, and sat there for a long moment. The house was gone, my marriage was gone, and whatever life I had known was now reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. But I was still here. I was still breathing. I started the engine, the low hum filling the silence around me, and pulled out of the parking lot. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, and for the first time since the attic, I let myself hope just a little that somewhere down that road, there might be something waiting for me. Something better. Something real. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through an empty landscape. The sun was rising now, bleeding pale orange light across the horizon, but it felt distant, like it was happening in another world, one I no longer belonged to. The hum of the engine and the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder were the only sounds keeping me tethered to reality. My mind felt heavy, weighed down by the events of the last 24 hours. The attic. The smell of gasoline. The soft flicker of flames reflected in my rearview mirror. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stop moving. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant reliving every moment, every sound, every word spoken in my home that now felt like a distant memory. My chest felt tight, like there was a stone lodged somewhere behind my ribs, pressing down on my lungs every time I tried to take a breath. For hours I drove in silence, letting the empty road pull me forward. The landscapes changed, the skeletal outlines of trees against the sky, the occasional distant farmhouse, a gas station sign flickering in the morning haze, but nothing registered. It was all background noise to the storm raging inside my head. I thought about my daughter, her small hands wrapped around her favorite stuffed toy, her laughter, her innocence. She deserves so much better than this chaos, better than two parents tangled in a web of lies and betrayal. At some point, I pulled into another nameless gas station, the kind that had seen better days decades ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I leaned against my car, sipping a bottle of water I'd grabbed from inside. The air was sharp and cold, biting at the edges of my face, but it felt grounding, somehow real. I stared at the horizon, my breath visible in the chilled morning air, and wondered how I'd let it get this far. The attic, the wallet, his face. It all looped in my head, unstoppable, relentless. There was no escaping it, no turning it off. I kept going back to that single moment when I flipped open that wallet and saw his ID staring back at me. Someone so familiar. Someone who should have never been anywhere near my home, let alone hidden above it. I wondered if they'd planned it all together, the lies, the hiding, the manipulation. Did they laugh at me when I wasn't around? Did they roll their eyes at my obliviousness? Every thought was like swallowing glass, sharp and painful, leaving wounds that couldn't be stitched closed. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was how long it had been going on right under my nose. How many dinners had he listened to from above us? How many nights had he been just a few feet away while I slept, blissfully unaware? I leaned back against the car, letting my head fall back as I stared up at the pale sky. My body felt hollow, like a shell something left behind after the important parts had been scooped out and discarded. I didn't recognize myself anymore. This version of me, the one who had walked away from his home, his marriage, his entire life, felt like a stranger. Eventually I got back into the car and started driving again. The hours blurred together, the landscape shifting but never really changing. Somewhere along the way, I spotted a cheap roadside motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly in the daylight. Without thinking, I pulled into the parking lot. The room was small, cramped, and smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and the bedspread looked like it had seen better days, but it was quiet. Safe. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as the weight of everything pressed down on me again. I thought about my wife, about her voice as she spoke to our daughter. Don't tell Daddy, he'll get upset. The words echoed in my mind, cruel and sharp. How many other secrets had she hidden behind that smile of hers? How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied so effortlessly? I could almost hear her voice now, so sweet, so calm, like butter melting on warm bread. But none of it was real. It was all smoke and mirrors, a carefully constructed illusion meant to keep me docile, to keep me from asking questions. And it had worked until it didn't. As the sun began to set, I found myself sitting on the floor by the window, watching cars pass by on the highway in the distance. I wondered how many other people out there were living lives built on lies, on fragile foundations that could crumble at any moment. How many of them were just like me, blindsided by the people they trusted the most? Somewhere deep in my chest, buried beneath the numbness and exhaustion, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger or sadness, or even regret. It was quieter than that, smaller. It felt like the faintest hint of clarity, like a whisper in the middle of a storm. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't erase the betrayal, the lies, or the fire that had consumed everything I'd built. But I was still here. My heart was still beating, my lungs were still pulling in air. That had to count for something. I thought about my daughter again, her smile, her laugh, the way she'd run into my arms after school. I had to figure out a way to rebuild, to carve out something stable for her, even if it was just a sliver of peace in the middle of all this chaos. Night fell, the motel room cast in shadows broken only by the faint glow of the neon sign outside. I sat there in the dark, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. For the first time in what felt like days, I closed my eyes and let my body go still. The future felt uncertain, murky and distant, but one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to her, not to the ashes of a life that no longer existed. All I could do now was move forward, one step at a time, no matter how heavy my feet felt, or how dark the path ahead seemed. And so, with nothing left but the clothes on my back and the weight of the past pressing down on me, I let the night take me. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to sleep.